to another economic and industry update presented by Greenbrier's marketing team. I'm Mallory Moran and I'm joined by Jay Carter.
Thanks for having me, Mallory.
Let's start with a look at the overall economy. Jay, what are you seeing?
Well, Mallory, the big news is the soft landing that's been making headlines lately. So, a soft landing is what we call an economy that shifts from growth to slow growth, but ultimately avoids a recession. And that's what we're seeing in the overall numbers currently. For example, GDP in the second quarter rose 2.4%, and this was bolstered by consumer spending as well as business investment. And GDP is forecasted to grow at about 0.4% in 2024. Unemployment currently is back to pre-pandemic levels, and it's expected to stay there for a while, with a predicted average unemployment slightly over 4% for next year. Even inflation, Mallory, is showing signs of leveling off. CPI shows an increase of only 3% year over year, and this is the lowest increase since March of 2021. However, that still isn't enough for the Fed to throttle back interest rates, which the Fed has raised its interest rates at its July 2023 meeting to a target range of 5.25 to 5.5%, which is the largest in over 22 years.
And of course, we love to hear about low employment, but it does create challenges in attracting and retaining skilled workers, making it even more crucial that workforce development is part of Greenbrier's 5-year plan. But now let's pivot to the rail industry. The industry orders, deliveries, and backlog reports for this quarter showed some very promising numbers. Railcar orders nearly doubled from the first quarter with over 16,000 units. Deliveries showed modest growth with an increase of almost 4,000 units to a total of just below 12,000. And finally, backlog reversed course this quarter and increasing to just under 60,000. Jay, help us put these numbers in perspective. What are you seeing in railcar loadings?
Sure. Total North American rail volumes finished down 4.6% year over year in the second quarter. And so we're still in the midst of an extended freight down cycle caused by multiple factors. On the one hand, West Coast port backups have prompted many shippers to switch to East Coast ports, which we know this tends to favor truck over rail. This was then compounded by labor slowdowns in Los Angeles and Long Beach, as well as strikes at British Columbia ports. Now, there is a bright spot in the volume data, though, in the railcar volume data, and that is the automotive sector. So despite high interest rates, as I mentioned earlier, auto sales are actually up, which is driving an earlier than expected stabilization in intermodal loadings.
That's great to hear. How is all this impacting rail velocity?
So velocity usually tends to increase when loadings are down, and that's the case here. That's what we're seeing. So rail velocity is up 6% year over year, and average terminal dwell is down over 3% year over year. Now, CSX is clearly leading in this area with very strong service metrics sustained for several quarters. However, Norfolk Southern and UP have company-specific issues. Norfolk Southern's remediation work in East Palestine, Ohio is serving as an operational headwind, while UP's CEO transition is delaying many major service changes. Overall, though, we expect improved service levels and more consistency in freight transit to continue, though it remains to be seen whether shippers will see this as a reflective increase in operational performance.
It'll be interesting to see how some of the upcoming improvements to service will influence shippers' confidence in rail shipping, like the rollout of Rail Pulse and other telematics. But Jay, what about storage?
Yes, Mallory. So the big factor in storage right now is grain, which has experienced an unusual harvest season due to weather conditions and demand. Grain cars in storage shot up over 10,000 units last month. However, the disruption in grain production caused by the war in Ukraine is predicted to trigger an increase in demand for North American grain next year. So we expect that trend to reverse. Now, Overall, rail cars in storage totaled about 324,000 units, representing over 19% of the total North American fleet in July. And when we talk about the cars that were scrapped, about 4,400 total rail cars were scrapped in the month of July, and grain accounted for about 738 of those.
Thanks, Jay. Any final thoughts?
Yes, Mallory. So the last time we mentioned uncertainties related to the perceived fragile banking sector at the time. Since then, the weakness in the banking sector has somewhat abated. However, given that we will be in an elevated interest rate environment for some time, this could hamper railcar loadings growth, which then on the contra would increase and or improve railcar velocity.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you for joining us. We hope you'll find this video valuable. Be sure to check out next quarter's edition.